This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, medical, or mental health advice. We speak from our personal experiences and opinions. The views expressed are solely those of the individual speaker and are not intended to malign any group, club, organization, or business.
Well, welcome everybody. Welcome back to Confronting the Line. I am super excited about today's conversation. I have two very special guests / experts with me today, and to have a really specific conversation about how and if transformational methodologies can be used outside of the traditional therapeutic setting safely and in a healthy manner. And if so, what are the conditions and practices required for that? So I got, as those of you who've been listening to me for a while know, this is pretty much a little bit of an obsession of mine after spending 25 years myself teaching, training trainers, designing and developing courses and programs that are designed to create a mindset shift for the participants and guests. And I've done a little bit of that in a corporate settings and a lot of that in what we call an open enrollment setting or in a LGAT sort of format. And then later in my career, coming upon and understanding that there were some dangers to that I did not understand. And since my book came out, Is This a Cult? Confronting the Line Between Transformation and Exploitation, a lot more of that has come to my awareness as quite literally, hundreds of former staff, program leaders, and participants have called me and reached out to me. One, thanking me for asking the questions that I ask in my book, but also sharing their stories and their stories of both help and harm. So I'm excited to have with me today Dr. John Hunter, who is a South African researcher and lecturer based in Johannesburg. His interest in large group awareness trainings and their impact on mood and psychosis is grounded in his personal experience of bipolar disorder and his participation in an LGAT in 2010. In 2017, John completed a PhD in psychology at the University, I don't know how to say it, John.
KwaZulu-Natal.
Okay, I'll let you say that. Proposing a neurobiological explanation for the relationship between large group awareness training conditions and their results. And he just recently published an absolutely fabulous book, Manufacturing Mania, the Dopamine Hypothesis of the Religious Experience. And then I also have with me today Dr. Ed Gurowitz, our resident expert. And a respected neuropsychologist, author, and consultant, he brings over 50 years of experience in personal and organizational transformation. He is trusted, engaged, and deeply insightful with a rare ability to balance strategic vision with the awareness of the dark side of leadership and change. And which has really been the basis for my relationship with Ed, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful. I want to do a special acknowledgement, Ed, of literally you are one of the only senior level leaders in this kind of work that's been willing to engage authentically with these questions and take an honest look at the body of work as well as your own experience and the impact that it's had over a lifetime of work. So I just really have a lot of deep, deep respect for that.
And John, you have to mention my book too.
Yes, I have it here. Yes, your recently released book, Transformation From Potential to Practice, which that subtitle really nails it for me because it speaks to one of the big fallacies. I have a bit of a problem with the word transformation because it implies to the listener this instantaneous and whole change all at once. That's sort of how we hear that word. And anybody who reads Ed's book and spends time with Ed and I are about to do a masterclass where we're going to go through chapter by chapter and discuss the various ideas. And what I appreciate, Ed, is that potential, which is an opening and to practice. And there's practice. Any change requires practice over time. And I love your add-on in community. So to me, that's been a really great, to have somebody to talk about these ideas within the healthy application and use who's also willing to acknowledge and look at the unhealthy ones. And then Dr. John, your work since I first heard you, I think it was on Chris Shelton, can't remember, but the number of interviews before your book even came out, really explaining when you went through and explained large group awareness trainings and what's happening in their neurobiologic, like what's happening in the brain, was so illuminating, not just because it was recognizable, but it kind of explained a lot. Because 26 years later, one of the things I've wrestled with is this idea that Landmark, that was the group I participated with, changed my life. And really, 26 years after making that kind of statement, you kind of look back and you go, did it? Really? And that's an open inquiry for me. And it's also an unanswerable question. Like we'd have to literally go back and relive the life, having not done that to even have an answer. But understanding the impact of the dopamine high that one gets in these kinds of trainings, which that really is the hallmark for me of large group awareness training, is that.
Well, I think an important thing to mention is that it's a hypothesis. So
Mhm.
it's a theory for what's going on. And I think it is very important to mention that fact. It's kind of going,
Right.
well, there's useful literature that we can look at to kind of say, well, what's going on in the seminars? What does the literature kind of say about the effects of stress and sleep disruption and goal attainment on the seeking system or on dopamine? And does the transformation that is promised by a lot of these organizations line up quite well with what we know to be the effects of seeking arousal of dopamine elevation? And I think that theoretically it looks very close and it seems to be quite a nice explanation. But if you're going to look at it scientifically, then we'd have to actually do some empirical tests to actually see what's going on. So I think it is important to realize that it's a theory, it's a hypothesis, and more work has to be done for it to be confirmed. Yeah.
I appreciate you saying that, John. The other piece, Anne, in what you said, and the more I work with you and talk to your audience, particularly the audience for your book, the more I realize that a big part, yes, to the dopamine part and all the rest of it, but a big part is what you said. Landmark changed my life. I hear that constantly. And it's a question of locus of control. Landmark didn't change anybody's life. People went to Landmark. They had an experience. If they put the experience into practice, their life probably changed. But when part of organizations like Landmark, and they're not the only one, certainly Scientology, others, is demanding that people assign the locus of control, the is the psychological term, the source, if you want to use that term, assign the source of what happened to the methodology, the organization, the leader, etc., and not owning that they changed themselves. If your life changed after Landmark, and mine certainly did, I changed it, not Landmark.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that I'd say is that there's a huge emphasis in these seminars of taking personal accountability and feeling like you are responsible for things that are going on in your life. So it seems strange then that the credit is then passed to the organization when everything is your responsibility and kind of your fault. I mean, that's often the way that it seems to be communicated. So if anything goes wrong as a result of participating, and my research shows that that is often the case, when people are in these elevated states, they might do something, decisive that leads to them getting a new job or starting a new business or starting a new relationship. And those things might work out well. But when they do the same things and they result in, saying something offensive at work or saying something that they shouldn't say, or, divorcing a husband or wife, then suddenly that's not the responsibility of the organization. That's the responsibility of the person. So there's a lot of double standards being thrown
Absolutely
around. And I think that's a big issue. And then, Anne, to get to your primary sort of question, which is, can these transformations occur in a healthy way, in a way that's free from risk? I think we would have to speak about what we conceptualize transformation to be, because a lot of the time when you dig into it, nobody ever seems to really speak about it at the organizations in terms of what they mean by breakthroughs and transformations. But it seems to mean that period at the end that lasts a couple of days to a couple of weeks where people feel as if they are completely transformed. And that ability to take that and turn it into something meaningful, I think has to be evaluated, but also the safety of doing that to a big group of people where it's very difficult to screen people. I don't know how easily that can be done. I've got no doubt that there can be personal development courses and seminars that can add a huge amount of value to big groups of people. I think psychology falls short in a lot of ways. One-on-one therapy falls short, and there are some other aspects where it's not adding the value that it could be. So I think that there definitely is a space for this, but I just don't know if the stress release, euphoria model is something that can be applied safely and ethically, because it's incredibly tempting to make it as powerful as possible in order to sell more seats. And to do that, you're going to be risking people's health. That's my take on it.
No question, John, that everything you just said is correct. And it's why in my book I emphasize practice. And as Anne said, practice over time in community. One of the better transformational programs I've worked with for many years is called the Mankind Project. It's a weekend program. Fits all the criteria of an LGAT, except that the groups are relatively smaller. They're like up to 40 people. But then they're followed by, and this is all free, all voluntary, people organize themselves into what are called integration groups to put what they learned in the weekend into practice. And there's data that show that the people who participate in those integration groups have a much longer lasting, deeper impact in their life than people who don't. Otherwise, it's a high, it's a momentary experience, or at least a few day experience. So and the risk. There is no change without risk.
So let me knock off a couple of quick things I think my audience, in particular, people listening to this, are going to be listening for. So one, John, can you sort of state simply what are the criteria for LGAT? Because I know I talk about it a lot and people always go, oh, and then they translate it to any large group meeting. And I'm like, no, the group size is somewhat incidental. I mean, it is happening in a group, but that isn't the primary criteria. What would you say are the basic criteria that make something a large group awareness training versus not a large group awareness training?
Sure, this would take quite a while to do. So, I mean, the way that I've described it before is almost like a Venn diagram. So you may have one group over here, another group over here, and there's overlap between them. They both might be described as a large group awareness training. And this term's been around. I think Morton Lieberman was the person that put it forward in the 70s. And it was basically used to describe EST and LifeSpring and actualizations and Psi seminars and a couple of other organizations that were around at the time without necessarily putting criteria together about what a large group awareness training is. In my view, the things that I would say are probably good indicators that an organization is an LGAT is that it's got a fairly clear lineage to mind dynamics. I would say that the seminars last over 3 to 5 days. I would say that they tend to involve high stress and culminate with a graduation of some sort, and they lead to an elevated state with very specific indicators of that elevated state. So I would say that the thing that they were selling is something that they refer to as a breakthrough or as a transformation, but it presents like hypermania. So you've got euphoria, confidence, energy, productivity. I would say that most of these organizations have had claims of psychosis occurring in participants, claims of depression occurring after. So it's more by like the fruits that you can recognize. To use a Christian metaphor, it's more by the fruits that you can recognize what the organization is. I would say that the sales model plays a part in it as well. So having a sales team that are volunteers, having a lot of the people running the organization that are volunteers, I would say that that's an important thing. The fact that you've got people that are graduates that are doing, 90% of the sales is an element of them. But if I had to put a document together, it would take me quite a while to kind of say these are exactly all the criteria. Some would count more, some would count less. I mean, I think, and it's quite similar to saying like, what is a manic episode? If you look in the DSM, you might get these 2 or 3 major criteria and 7 other criteria that you want to look at, and you've got to count the first 2 plus 3 of the next 7. But if you really understand what mania looks like, that's quite a superficial tick boxy way of trying to understand it. And I think that it requires a bit more of a qualitative explanation to really understand what they involve.
You did a pretty good job there. And I think you're speaking to an aspect. Anytime we put a label or a word on something, we confine it, right? So then we're trying to define it, and the definition always to an extent sort of confines it. and leaves out the nuance, which is part of why I want to have this conversation today, right? That's some of the nuance. I'm curious, why did you mention, why mind dynamics? So it has its roots, because as we know, well, as I know, and maybe many of my listeners do not, but EST, which is the forerunner to the forum, which is the forerunner to the landmark work, was straight out of mind dynamics. In fact, that was, Werner had the mind dynamics license, as it were, as it existed in those times, from mid 1970, about July of 1970 ish, until he converted the organization to EST in October of 1971 and was doing mind dynamics trainings. Just a little bit of, I've learned so much. I feel like I'm like a Werner Est history nerd now, as I've learned so much about that. But I'm curious why that program. What do you find that most of these groups link back to that program in some way, or?
Well, I mean, I think that there seem to be multiple influences. You've got encounter groups that were going on during the 1960s, sensitivity groups, that sort of thing. You had Synanon that was using something called the game, which involved quite a lot of confrontation and that sort of thing. You had Scientology, you had Silver Mind Control, which seemed to have been influenced quite a lot by Scientology, which actually preceded Mind Dynamics. But with Alexander Everett and Mind Dynamics, you had an organization where you had Charlene Aframo, who ended up at, I think she was initially at EST, then went to LifeSpring, then went back to EST, but she was
Werner's mind dynamics trainer.
Exactly. So she was his. But then you had you had Robert White and Randy Revel and John Hanley, who formed with Charlene Aframo, formed LifeSpring. So they were all at Mind Dynamics. Then you had Thomas Wilhite, who was also at Mind Dynamics. He finds seminars. You had Stuart Emery, who was at Mind Dynamics, who formed Actualizations, and he was the first CEO of EST. So it's a very incestuous kind of group. They all seem to kind of come out that one organization, and it seems like most of them took part in leadership dynamics as well. So that was William Penpatrick's, like very hectic, if you had to take LGATs and take away all rules and make sure that nobody could ever watch what was going on, that seemed to be what leadership dynamics was, which was just extreme stress, humiliation, kind of abuse, leading to these elevated states at the end. And so it seems to me that Earhart and a number of people saw, okay, there's some useful things in mind dynamics, but also we can find that this high stress process followed by a release seems to lead to these elevations. And that was kind of cobbled together. And so you've got a lot of people doing very similar things. I mean, if you read Hanley's book, he says he took a lot of inspiration from EST and from Earhart. And then when you look at a lot of the LGAT organizations around it at the moment, they're almost identical to LifeSpring, because I think EST and then later Werner Earhart and Associates and then Landmark were far better at protecting their intellectual property and possibly stopping other people from using it. But if you look at so many of these organizations around the world, in Asia and Australia and even in South Africa, the one that I did, you've got all the identical exercises that we used in LifeSpring. Even in the troubled teen industry, and I'm doing some research on that at the moment. I'm interviewing former students from the troubled teen industry in the US. They're talking about the red and black game. They're talking about the lifeboat exercise. They're talking about also Sprach Zarathustra. That's 2001: A Space Odyssey music that was played at the beginning and the end of every. I mean, it's all just copy and paste. So for all of these claims of originality and creativity that these seminars are supposed to generate, they all just seem to be using exactly the same thing and then claiming that they're doing something new and original. So that's why I'd say mind dynamics seems to be at least a good touchstone in terms of like that seems to be quite a clear place that a lot of these organizations came from.
Yeah, I had a chance to spend a few days with Alexander Everett in the 80s, and he was mystified. He was actually visiting in the Bay Area at Werner's invitation. I don't remember what all they were doing, but I was his host and spending time with him. He was quite mystified by the whole thing. He really did not understand how this had happened, and I think to some extent also how come he didn't get a piece of the pie. Remember also, though, that that Werner at least took a lot from Scientology and a lot from Dale Carnegie. Werner thought Dale Carnegie was quite the one of the best trainings around. So when he saw something he liked, he took it or tried to. In the case of Fernando Flores, who wasn't having any, but yeah, they all, many of them at least, the ones you mentioned, go back to mind dynamics and to Alexander Everett, but even before that to Silva.
And Ed, you came on the scene, I believe, 1978. I think, if I remember correctly,
that's
you did
right.
the training in 1978. By 1980 or so, you've left your private practice and you're now working.
81.
Yeah, when you're working with Werner, you become a trainer. You were a part of the team that transitioned from the S training to the forum, as
correct.
It's still called, but it's got
twice. First to a 2-weekend forum, and then I was on the team that I led the first 3-day forum.
And did you know about I know it's always hard. I mean, that was 50 years ago, but I'm kind of curious about did you know what your thoughts were at that time, particularly given you were a neuropsychologist, you were sort of in the field, in the domain. What was the thinking in the world around things like mind dynamics, around these encounter techniques? I'm just always a little bit curious about what do you think about that then? Understanding I'm asking the now Ed.
Yeah, no, I understand, but I can remember what I thought about it then. Pardon me. I have to back up a second. There were a few of us. There were 65 trainers at our peak. This was prior to my leaving in 91. And there were very few of us, maybe half a dozen, who actually had scientific training and led from what I call leading from first principles. We didn't simply memorize the manual, we went back to where it started. Given that, I never accepted the deification of Werner, as a few of us didn't, but a lot of us did. A lot of them did. As far as the world, it was very controversial. If you want to know how controversial something is, look to satire. And there was a tremendous amount of satire. Most famous one being North Dallas 40, which was a film where Bert Convy played Werner. And it was brilliant.
Did it have another name? Because I have seen
maybe overseas, but it was about a football team, about the Dallas Cowboys. I don't remember if they called them that. And a bunch of the players who went to this training, led by Bert Convy. And it was clearly, if you knew the S training, it was, down to, the guy has a
That's not the one with Chris Christopherson and Burt Reynolds.
No.
I don't know the one.
Give me a second. I'm just going to go grab something. You guys carry on. I'll be back in a moment.
Yeah.
But the world looked at it with a very jaundiced eye. First of all, encounter groups were already looked at with a very jaundiced eye because they had a tendency to not to turn violent, but to turn into command and control. T groups, particularly Tavistock groups. So it was controversial. And a lot of the controversy, oddly enough, focused on what I think were trivial things, the long hours, that you can't go to the bathroom, you can't eat, all that stuff, which, was 2 days' work.
However, those things are very pivotal to the high stress environment. To the...
Oh, yeah, no question. No question, but that's not why people focused on them. People focused on them because they were uncomfortable and because they were considered controlling. Did you find it, John?
I was going to say, yeah, there's another movie called Semi-Tough, which has got Chris Christopherson.
I forgot about that one. Absolutely. Yeah. I always think about North Dallas 40, and I forgot about Semi-Tough.
Yeah.
But those are the very things that create the stress. And look, this is alive today. When I worked with Yoga Man, he had a term, get to the edge of your mat, which was a term for get to the edge of your life, like push, 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 push. And, he's a power yoga guy, which is controversial in the yoga world by itself, because it's a kind of pushing the limits, which is many yogis think is sort of antithetical to the yoga mindset, which is not based in that at all. So this whole, and now I just saw an ad on Facebook yesterday. It was buy your own personal blow up cold plunge thing, right? So this is all the rage now is to basically drop your body in cold and get out. And it creates this kind of euphoric experience. And so we're chasing this euphoric experience. And that's
which is generated by stress slash pain. Yeah.
Exactly. And we have, no pain, no gain. I mean, I think this is so integrated into our society. And we're just beginning to really question it on a large scale, mostly because some younger people are kind of like, screw that. I'm not going to sacrifice my life, my quality of life to gain is, coming up in the younger generations. It's certainly there with my children. So this sort of questioning of that stress, but that's interesting, Ed, so at that time, anything else you would say about how it occurred for you at that time?
I would get feedback from time to time from people who, I want to say claimed, who were damaged or felt they were damaged by the process. And I would mostly, the official line on that was, as John said earlier, well, that's on them. I never bought that. I had a lot of respect, as did many of us, for the power of what we were doing to do harm. But we had no way to, it's like in the training itself, unless somebody showed signs of decompensating in some way, we had no way to know. We heard about it afterward. Now, as you know, Ann and John, I don't think you know this, early on in the early 80s, I instituted a whole system to review people, to screen people based on certain questions that were asked on the registration form. Have you ever been in therapy? Have you ever been hospitalized? Things like this. And we would have, for every center and every training, we would have a therapist on call. And I had went into trainings, was called in when somebody was acting oddly, and would often take them out of the training, and on one or two occasions suggested or more than suggested, they go to the hospital. So the recognition was there that it could do harm, but it was considered an aberration. It was considered a rare side effect, not a main effect. If it was a drug, it would have been listed amongst the side effects, but with a very low percentage. And it was a low percentage, considering the thousands of people.
So this is what I would kind of say about that. I think firstly, if you've got a very successful organization, which EST was and which Werner Erhardt and Associates was, at least for a period, and you've got people lining up around the block and your sales are not really an issue, or you're filling the trainings and it's not much of a problem, then I can understand that you've got, if you do have some sort of screening process, possibly it's going to be followed exactly how it should be. But as soon as you start getting into a situation where there's incredible pressure to meet sales targets, which everyone that's worked for an LGAT organization can identify with, then suddenly, and I hear these stories frequently, that somebody will say, yeah, I mentioned that I've got this problem. And they said to me, well, are you okay with it? There are some risks, and people would take part anyways. I would say that as soon as the sales pressure is kind of confronting the need to screen people, then that creates a conflict of interest.
No question.
I would also say that if the mechanism that I think is going on generating the transformations is the possible mechanism, I don't know how you would screen people effectively. So if it's about a stress response to something that's leading to a neurobiological, neurochemical change in what's going on, you have to understand the person's psychological makeup. You have to understand their neurobiological makeup. You need to understand their history, because speaking about certain things is going to affect some people more than others. So their life history is going to have an impact as well. The average age of diagnosis for bipolar disorder, for example, is 25. Some disorders it's older. You've got a lot of people that are younger than that are coming, and they might say, well, I've never had any diagnosis, I don't have any problems, but they may have that predisposition. So I don't know how you would screen those people out. And then the last thing that I would say is that, in order to understand the potential harm, it's something that has to be looked at quite seriously. And I think at the time, if you're only counting the harm as people that are showing visible signs of psychosis or losing touch with reality while they're in the seminar, I think that that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of potential harm that can come from participation.
No question.
So the person that seems just a bit elevated and ends up going and spending a whole bunch of money that they don't have, or, doing something reckless at their job and getting themselves into trouble, or cheating on their husband or wife, which is a symptom of mania. It's not a symptom, but it's a possible consequence when you're feeling very empowered and you kind of feel like nothing can go wrong with whatever you're doing. Those are things that are not being monitored as potential consequences. So if the official line is, even if a person has a complete mental breakdown, that's your responsibility, then there's absolutely zero chance that somebody's going, well, that other more subtle thing that happened was our fault. So in order for people to understand the risks, you need to identify what those risks might be and give people real warnings. I mean, if I look at
and you've got to throw in the legal as well. You've got to throw in legal liability as well, because the organization even with getting letters from the person's therapist, screening by myself or one of the people I recruited, therapists I recruited, the whole thing. The organization still had to play CYA with regard to legal liability. So they could never admit that anything was their fault.
Yeah. And it's a very tricky situation to be in.
And I don't think that's I always try to be fair to Landmark and those, that's a problem in our legal system here in the United States. It doesn't really pull for responsibility and accountability because it's so punitive. But what's interesting to me, because Ed, I've heard you describe in some other interviews we've done, this rigorous setup that you had created in your time there, right? That there was a level of screening.
Rigorous is your word. I wouldn't call it rigorous.
Well, okay, compared to what was there when I was around?
Compared to what was there, absolutely.
Well, here's the main difference,
It was a safety net.
But here's the main difference. So the way you describe it in the time that you were there in the 80s is that, one, there was a therapist, somebody who's actually trained in therapeutic, psychological practice, licensed. Yeah. They have that training. In my time, yes, there was always somebody who was on call. My husband was a center manager in the Seattle area for a long time. And so he was, those are kind of the main managers that are managing all this. So if there's an incident, is what it's called, or something that happens, a well-being incident in a program, it's the center manager who gets involved. And there was always somebody on call. However, in my time, it became a trainer or a forum leader, as they were called by then. And it was all internal. And now I don't know 100%. I asked my husband, I asked him recently, I said, do you know for sure that there wasn't some psychologist or something in the background? And he said he didn't know of one, which just meant in the interface, that's not who he was dealing with.
He would have known. No, the system broke down. The system broke down.
But I think it broke down in large part because of the legal aspect that you're talking about. I mean, they internalized all of that. And another thing that they're very known for being litigious for people using their work. John, you mentioned LifeSpring was a little bit more open. So more people took the LifeSpring training and started to do stuff with it.
Well, they died as an organization officially. So I don't know if it was about them being more open. I just think that they stopped operating. So there was no one to kind of chase up.
Part of Landmark's, and I was told this in various staff meetings, but part of their intense scrutiny on people leaving the group and not having them use the work was because they did know to an extent that it was dangerous, but they felt that their internal training was sufficient. We were told this.
Well, that may be true. Remember, you and I don't overlap in Landmark.
No, we don't, because I'm 90s.
I left in 91, and you came later.
Yeah. I'm like 95.
This is what I can tell, and this is a bias. I'll own this as a bias on my part. They went after people because they're bullies and because they got money. They went after forum leaders who were not doing anything with using the work. They went after a close friend of mine who was the one who brought the training and then the forum to Israel almost single-handedly. And they went after him because he was in the coaching business. And it was known. You could pay him $10,000 and they'd go away. And
the whole thing is based on
firsthand did.
The whole thing's based on a certain kind of thievery, and nobody is more on guard against thievery than thieves.
Yeah, well, but my point is, I don't think it had anything to do with safety. I think it had everything to do with, quote unquote, protecting their quote unquote IP, intellectual property, and secondly, making money. Because
meaning
as the
that
organization began to decline, the lawsuits began to increase.
That's right. And yes, I have a whole team doing research and are finding lots of lawsuits. And interestingly, so far we haven't found one in fighting over the intellectual property, which I find now I'm not sure that we've looked in that direction very hard.
There is one, but it was
There's
someone
got
who
to be.
sued them.
But I just do think that, that we were told that in a staff and leader training that, part of that to me, that tells me that they did know to an extent that the programs themselves, that the work could be harmful in the wrong hands. And then they had a kind of, probably still have, I don't know, but had a kind of, I can't think of what's the right word, but this belief that somehow they alone inside their insular world could protect against that, which was to me just like really off. And they did have
they also had a fallback. They had a fallback position, which was to compare the percentage of people that they knew of who had had any kind of negative effect from the programs against the percentage in the population at large. And it was, somehow always came out lower.
That's
so
insane,
obviously
by their own
it says
records.
that. Yeah,
by their own records.
It was a rigged game, but nonetheless, that was the fallback position was, you get thousands of people, you're going to have a certain number who go crazy, commit suicide, etc. And that was part of the justification.
If I look at it, and my view is that people should be able to run these organizations, but people should, if they're going to participate, they need to have the full information. So they need to have the information about the potential risks and the rewards. And in my view, the rewards have been massively overstated, and in some cases, deliberately, they're misleading in terms of what the rewards are, and the risks are massively understated as well. So if you look on landmark sites, I think they say that it's 1,000th of 1% of people have very severe negative reactions. So I don't know where that research is being done, how they're following up. So if somebody reads that, they think there's absolutely no chance of anything going wrong. So that's the risk side of things. And I don't know if you've looked at the section of the website called independent research. I mean, Ed, you've published research before. You know what a high quality study is. There's 7 or so, studies sitting on that site that, wouldn't pass a peer review by, a first-year university student. There's no methodology. There's no indication of how participants were sampled. There's no indication of how things were measured or not. And I think 2 of the studies come up with like a 94% satisfaction rate. So that worries me because firstly, that's incredibly high, but also it's incredibly consistent. The chance of 2 studies coming up with that exact success rate seem incredibly small. So there's also the study that was conducted by Fisher et al. On the forum. So it was published in 1989. That was a double-blind, peer-reviewed study, very strong methodology, and it found almost no short-term benefits and 0 long-term benefits. That's not sitting on the websites. So if people are going to make informed decisions about whether they want to participate, if they want to weigh up the risks versus the benefits, they need to have access to all of the information. And if you've got an organization that's preaching integrity and responsibility and authenticity, and they're providing misleading information or keeping some information away from people, I think that that's an issue. I mean, quite recently, not that recently, but about 2017, Werner sat down with James Doty of Stanford University. And I don't know what that relationship was about, but James Doty is a neurosurgeon and professor at Stanford. And he said innumerable studies have been done that have demonstrated very scientifically the positive effects of EST and these types of organizations. And I contacted him and I said, can you point me towards any of these studies? I've done a literature review. I've tried to find some of these studies. And he said, I don't know of any such studies. If I said that, it's not true. And so you've got that sort of information floating around there that is impacting people's cost-benefit analysis about whether they participate or not. And I don't think that that's fair. I think that for people to have informed consent, they need to have access to the right information.
Agreed.
Well, and that speaks to the charisma factor, because that that thing happened, I believe, after or maybe during the time that I was working with Werner, but I wasn't involved with that particular thing. But I was very involved with Werner's, I call it his mini comeback tour, which very much involved sidling up with these high level academics, which the door was opened a lot by Mike Jensen as well as others. Those are definitely some of Werner's favorite people to, as he would say, ride the coattails of. And one of the things that's often thought is that people who get involved in these kinds of things and take it too far, either their participation or whatnot, too far, meaning to the point where it's detrimental to their finances, to their mental health, to, whatever, functioning, some functioning.
Relationships.
Their relationships, exactly. That's probably one of the bigger victims, unless you just stay related to people who are in the network.
I really think that that's something that isn't often discussed enough. Is the number of people that speak to me, and the person that's participating hasn't necessarily had psychological. There's no psychological harm, but they just say the person is not like that is their life now, and now the interaction that we used to have has been severed because I'm not speaking the same language that they're speaking. I don't have that love that they have, and now it's caused a rift between us, and I think that that's a consequence that really needs to be considered as well.
Or if you do stay connected, you stay connected in a very superficial way. I was speaking with somebody recently whose sibling is a longtime forum leader and manager and whatnot, and she's clearly got a very loving family, but the family all know not to try to challenge anything related to Landmark or her career or whatnot. And they know that it's not healthy for her. And they're basically just sitting there waiting until the day when Landmark drops her off on the curb, which is they are wont to do. It's what they did to me. It's what they did to Ed. So what they've done, every single person that I know.
Drops off is kind. They kick you to the curb.
They kick you to the curb, exactly.
Well, it's like a bad relationship where
Right.
often you can't speak a person out of their affection for this other person, but you can see it's bad, and you just have to wait for it to run its course, and hopefully it does. Yeah.
Right. We've got a lot of that going on in the United States right now, too, with people and their voting preferences. Let's just say there's whole families that don't talk anymore, don't speak to each other or whatnot.
Yeah, I can understand that there's quite a bit of division about that. And can I ask a question?
Absolutely. I was just going to say, John, do you have any questions for Ed? Because I know you're a researcher and this has been a topic. And
Yes. So my question is, since the sort of starting question is, can this be done? Can it be effective? Should it be done? That sort of thing. My view is that the claims that are made by a lot of the organizations, and we can talk about the difference between organizations in the past and maybe some that exist today, but in the past, they're very big claims in terms of what the effects are going to be. So the effect sizes, if you had to measure them, would be quite large. The seminars also happen over a relatively short space of time, which is why, approaches like CBT can be studied quite scientifically because often there's quite a clear goal that you're looking for, and the intervention happens over a relatively short period of time as opposed to psychodynamic therapy, for example. So it would seem that these seminars are well designed to be scientifically assessed in terms of their effectiveness. I can't understand why studies have not been done. If the claimed benefits are a fraction of what the benefits are a claimed fraction of what they could be, why wouldn't scientific studies be able to demonstrate that? And given that the industry there's so much uncertainty around it, and there's so much skepticism around it, and it would boost sales, it would boost credibility, it would do all of these things. And I think that there are a lot of researchers who would do it for free. I think that there are a lot of people doing masters and PhDs and even postdoc students who would be like, this is a very interesting thing to study. If you give me access, we will come and do a study and produce results. So why do you think that hasn't happened in 50 years, other than that one study? Yeah.
I think there's a number of reasons. I don't know what it's like in KwaZulu-Natal, but in American universities, there is a heavy bias against negative results. So if these studies were to say these programs don't do anything, they'd be hard to sell to a doctoral committee.
A journal. Yeah.
Or a journal. but particularly a doctoral committee if you're talking about students doing it.
Yeah.
And that's said by somebody whose doctoral thesis produced negative results, and I still got my doctorate.
Yeah. Yeah.
But more importantly, it really goes to this issue of potential and practice. What these programs do at best. And so, for example, I mentioned Mankind Project. Great track record, been around 40 years. Does not fit any criteria of cult or anything else. And what it does in a weekend is it awakens the possibility. It gives so let me back up. My definition of transformation, and this is critical because nobody ever defines it. My definition, and I'll credit Werner with this, he wrote about it in 78 or 79, is a shift in thinking, a shift in perspective about oneself and the world that is essentially from being a victim, from being an object in a world full of objects of which you are one being acted upon, to recognizing that you create the context, you create the context, the only word I've got right now, for your own life. So it's like people go through life saying, who am I? That's the wrong question. The right question is, when I say, who am I, who's asked? Because that'll put you where you need to be. Now, but that's only a beginning. If nothing happens, if there is no practice, that will live as a peak experience. No question in my mind, it's a peak experience.
Yeah.
So if you're going to study, even you mentioned CBT, you'd have to do a longitudinal study. And you'd have to compare three groups, people who never had the therapy, people who had the therapy and never did anything else, and people who had the therapy and then continued in some sort of practice. Nobody's funding that kind of research.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of it. You want to do research on dopamine, you want to do research on pharmaceuticals, you want to do research on elementary particles. There's money, or at least there used to be until Trump turned us into the know-nothing Luddite state. But for this, psychological research in general has never been well funded in the United States, at least. And for this, I don't even know who would fund it. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to share. So about midstream through our time with the Being a Leader in the Effective Exercise of Leadership project, as I was, host of it, there was a person, very brilliant person, who works at a well-known, well-funded university, who did get a large grant from the NIH to do a study on the effectiveness of the ontological, phenomenological approach to leadership. So, and this person was very, she'd done studies on neuroscience and the recovery of brain after injury and so on. So just very, very accomplished woman. Now also happens to be a long time, SD, I call them. So that's in the circuit, those that started participating in the wacky world of Werner back in the S days. And she was just really brilliant and was training to deliver that course in her university and so on. And I was in a handful of meetings where they were meeting and talking about the criteria. So you said something, John Key, which is the people who were involved, like the Werners, would need to participate to an extent. They need to give access. Well, what I witnessed is there was no way in hell Werner is going to give full access to anybody about anything.
No access without control. Yep.
Because I even had a conversation with him. I wanted to do a marketing campaign making fun about the word ontological and phenomenological, right? So I wanted to do this whole marketing campaign, and they said, "Oh, okay, well, we have a call with Werner coming up. Why don't you get on and pitch it to Werner?" Now, that was a little bit odd because I never pitched any of my marketing campaigns to Werner. Werner was very generous with me and was pretty much let Ann do what she wants. Anyway, so we get on this call, and I had a web page started to design that had the definition of phenomenological and ontological. And, I cross-referenced against several dictionaries and picked the ones that I thought were the most sort of agreed. And immediately, Werner just started redefining the words. And within 2 minutes, I knew that my ad campaign was done. I mean, I just was done. Yeah. But the meeting went on for another hour at least. And, while it's happening, I'm already taking that off the website, and I know that campaign, because I'm not going to do a campaign using a made up version of the words, given the whole campaign was about the meaning of the words, right? Now, I didn't know at the time, I didn't understand about word salad. I didn't know about, redefining words. I didn't have any of that in my lexicon. I just knew it was not going to work. But when you work with people like this, you can't say no. And you get that at a very instinctual level. And I saw that happen around this study too. There was no way that this person who was so highly regarded, so accomplished, so whatnot, that she was going to be subservient to him and what he said. And I believe that study she did do, because I was giving her the cohorts out of the leadership course. We went through 2 or 3 programs, and she had a before the program questionnaire immediately following the program. And then I can't remember the increments, like 6 months, 1 year. And I believed it stopped at a certain point. But there were every question that was asked, even in what I would say was pretty highly subjective, because that's mostly what it was a series of questions that were then analyzed by the students and so forth and put together into these really great graphs and reports. But it was completely controlled to whatever degree it was allowed to happen by Werner. And the same thing he did with me on the words phenomenological and ontological on each question. And we know this from polling in the United States. You can get 2 radically different results on a poll depending on how you ask the question.
Yeah, but I mean, and the Fisher et al. Study from psychological effects of participating in a large group awareness training, which was published in '89 by a group of researchers. It was done, on the study, it says done with the support of Werner Erhard and Associates. We'd like to thank these people for, so it was done with full support, but it came out as, no long-term benefits, almost no short-term benefits. And so my sense
probably
is that,
why a study hasn't been done since.
Well, that's what I'm saying, is that I think probably because of that, nothing has been done
John,
subsequently.
when was that study done?
It was published in '89.
This is interesting. I never heard of it. And I was there at the time.
I'm guessing it would have been conducted around '87, '88.
Yeah,
and then
when I was in the
published
thick of it.
'89. Yeah.
We talked about Yankelovich, which is on the website.
That's
the thing. So the Yankelovich study, and so I've often said to myself, well, maybe that this study is not on the website because it was done during the days of the forum and not landmark. But then I found out the Yankelovich study which got positive results. That's on the website. And the more sophisticated, more scientific study is not on the.
Do you have a link to that study or a copy of it, Jim?
Absolutely, I can. I've got your email address. I can probably just send you
Please do.
the study. It's called, I think it's Fisher, Chinsky, Clark et al.
Jack Chinsky?
Yes, I think so.
My graduate school roommate.
Yeah. So yeah,
and cool. See, that tells me something about the study, because
participation in a large group awareness training.
Jack had a lot of integrity. If his name's on that study, I would trust that study.
Yeah.
Well, and the Yankelovich study, which was, I believe, only 1,300 participants that were all crafted and handed over by Landmark. And Landmark, I have several newspaper articles now reporting on. Landmark has gotten in trouble a handful of times. They actually, by Harvard, I mean, if we went to Harvard and said, hey, this study's still being used, Harvard, if they had they're kind of busy right now. They're having a bad couple of days. But if they Landmark actually has an agreement not to use that study for
Yankelovich now?
That's correct.
No, Yankelovich?
No, not the Yankelovich one. It's so on the website, one of the 7 pieces of independent research is something called the Harvard Business School case study,
which it says is out of print.
Which firstly is not a study. It's a case study. It's kind of like if I did a case study on Ted Bundy, it wouldn't mean that I'm endorsing Ted Bundy, So the fact that Harvard did a case study on Landmark, it shares a couple of things. It basically says, based on the case study, Landmark's got, 20 or 150 unique distinctions or something like that. It doesn't say anything about the effectiveness. And this is from, I think, 1998, the agreement that you're speaking about, Anne, in terms of not using it. And it's like 27 years later, it's still on the website. And again, a person that's not looking through the information and is kind of going, should I trust this or not? They see, oh, Harvard's reputable. I'm going to make an assumption that the seminar is safe and it's been tested and all that sort of thing. And so to me, it's relying on heuristics, and it's not allowing people to make informed decisions. Although, as you say, the thing is written there, it's out of print and it's no longer being produced. So that's in small print.
It just makes the claims untestable.
Yeah, so it's a problem from an informed consent perspective.
I agree. And I don't know, informed consent is a venerable principle in medicine, but I don't know how could you write an informed consent for something like the Landmark Forum that really did give the information people would need to consent. I mean, I don't know that it's even possible.
I don't think that it's binary, though. So I don't think that it's either it is or it isn't, but you can certainly move the needle further along the line towards giving people more information. And I think yeah, so I mean, there's some judgment that has to be exercised there, but like, I don't think it's a case of going, well, it's impossible to do it properly, so let's just provide like almost nothing, like not present some of these studies, exaggerate the effectiveness, like understate the harm.
Well,
like I think that those are the big problems. Yeah.
Stop lying about the results. Like just stop there. So I've started the Safe Practitioner Workshop, right? And where I'm leading them as a kind of discussion forum. So we can sort of learn. And I've learned a lot from those groups. We've had about 50 some practitioners of all kinds of modalities, everything from plant medicine to personal coaching to, any big spectrum of the personal development and wellness world. And one of the things that we came upon in our exploration about informed consent and answering this exact question, Ed, which is like, okay, well, what does that really look like? Well, one of the things that we, as a group, we landed on, we're like, well, don't promise results. Don't promise us you are going to be more effective in your relationships. You are going to be da-da-da. And, the higher up you get in these groups, the more outlandish the promises get. I mean, the staff member is told that they are going to be a force in the marketplace and they're going to be in high demand and they're going to da-da-da. Well, as a former staff member, I can tell you that is not true. And talking to a lot of former staff members who get ejected from the spaceship. That's my favorite analogy that somebody gave me. They're like, leaving Landmark is like being ejected from a spaceship. And it takes a while before you get out of space back onto the Earth. But when you do get to the Earth, you find out nobody cares.
That's exactly
Nobody cares. Right. And you do not have any special skill. You're pretty much, you might have special skill, but you don't have a way to communicate it or market it easily. You can do it with all kinds of sleight of hand, but mostly.
And you probably need to keep it at least disguised on your resume.
Absolutely. And
for many years, the entry on my resume from 81 to 91 was WAA Inc.
Right. Yeah, you want to keep it. So, or international training and development company. We were taught to say that in guest rooms, what is this? This is an international training and development company with 44 offices worldwide. And, I have the whole spiel. I can't seem to forget it. But my point is you don't have to lie. See, to me, they could actually offer, or somebody could, I actually have no hope left really for Landmark, but they could offer programs. One, take it out of the intense environment. You do not need to run a program with those kinds of hours. And if they just took out the bring guests part, you would save at least 5 hours out of the long weekend. So, make it normal hours, put in regular food breaks, let people take notes, let them have a table that they're sitting at. Just change the physical environment so that you're not creating so much stress. And then also,
what are you selling then, Anne? So if the product for a lot of the organizations is that peak experience, and if there isn't a proper follow-up and it's not being translated into something else, if they remove that, what is left?
Tools.
You're going to laugh. Possibility. I told you were going to laugh. You're selling.
Well, I don't know how easy it will be to sell. That's what I'm saying.
I make no claim that it's easy to sell.
Because people come out of it and they go, wow, I'm feeling amazing. This is incredible. And that's what brings other people in. So I'm saying I agree that there is something useful to sell. I agree with you, Ed. I think that there is something that you can market and sell, but it becomes a lot harder. It's so much easier when you've got
Ding, ding, ding.
these salesmen who are just bursting to tell other people about what they've been through. And you're not paying for sales. You've got your sales are people that are paying you, basically. Your salesmen are people that are paying
Well,
you.
as
And
their
so
sales,
the model starts getting cracks in it if you don't have those benefits.
so I've
Well,
been in
and
sales.
let me ask
Go ahead,
you,
and then I want
in the business world, the world you were in with the Being a Leader program, business and academics, that stuff, that I'm walking on cloud nine stuff doesn't sell at all.
to.
This
Not
I
true.
know.
No, not true. I mean, I raised a lot of money. I did a lot of sales. You know, I put, I don't know, I haven't added up the number, but, you know, over 1,000 people. And I was the salesperson. I mean, I
What
was
were
the
you
one.
selling? What were you selling?
So I was selling a certain level of bullshit. So the
Yeah, I
first thing
understand,
that
but I want to know what kind.
okay, you will leave this program being a leader. That means not relying on techniques to remember or practices, but being a leader as your natural self expression. Self expression means all ways of being and acting will be available to you. And exercising, that means functioning as, acting as a leader. That's how I sold the first couple programs, was just disseminating the title. Then after that, I got a little bit more savvy. So because I was mostly selling, honestly, to people who were already indoctrinated. And about 50% of every course were people who were an SD or a Landmarkian or whatever. And then they would bring business associates and whatnot, or their clients. So many of the licensed affiliates would bring their clients to the program. So I was selling to people that were already a little bit indoctrinated. Now I understand that I was selling the cult leader to the cult. So, in my opinion, but
Well, yeah.
but let me
Yeah.
tell you something from a sales perspective, because I've been in sales since I was 20 years old, and somebody took me under their wing and said, I'm going to teach you sales as a young single mother. You will always be safe. You'll always be able to have a job. And now that I've gotten distance from that lexicon and selling these big promises and frankly trying to sell possibility, which we would lament in guest room after guest room, how much people don't want that. Having now gotten fully out of that system and sort of being a little bit restored through my Safe Practitioner workshop back into what is the safe and ethical practice of sales look like? And then I realized I'm like, oh, well, I was actually trained in that in the 90s, which is you offer a product for what it is. You offer it, you don't make promises for a result. It's not within your dominion to promise a result. I would never promise somebody possibility out of participating. What I would say now would be something like, well, we have tools. These tools were created by this person. This is, I would put it out on the table and I would say, these are the, kinds of tool. And I would give some examples of some of the tools, like your transformation triangle that's in your book. I'm becoming a quick fan because I've been playing with that tool since I read the draft of your book. And now that I'm reading the final version that just came out, I've been like, kind of applying that tool and recognizing that there are places, and I did come to say this in being a leader, that this is not for everybody. These tools are not for everything, everywhere, all at once. So there's some simple things they can put in. Take out the grandiose promise actions. I tell my safe practitioners, what are you going to do at your course? I'm doing a women's wellness retreat right now. You know what we're going to do? We're going to actually get together in the kitchen every night and learn how to cook some really healthy, simple meals. We are going to get together with one of our guides that are coming as a meditation expert for professional people. She works with doctors. She's going to teach us various kinds of meditation. We are going to take walks and learn about the various plants and how to, with love and affinity for the land, gather. We have a native woman who's going to come help us do that. We're going to, and I talk about what are we going to do? And I leave it to the guest to determine what they're going to get out of that.
Interesting. I want to circle way back to the very beginning. John, you used the term breakthrough, if I remember correctly, at least related to, if not the same as transformation.
Yeah.
When I led a program for executives, so part of my inheritance when I got ejected from the spaceship, when I ejected myself actually, was I got licensed to a program that Werner had done in IBM in 1985. It was called Center for Management Design, and it then later came to be called Executive Excellence. And I revamped it. It was a 4-week program that sold for $40,000 in those days. And I revamped it. It was 8 weeks, 4 2-week sessions. I made it a 4-week program and lowered the price tag. And it was for high-level executives, many of whom had not done any other, hadn't done the training or the forum or anything. And what the selling point of it was, we would give them access to breakthrough results. And there was a very rigorous definition. I wrote a paper on this. There's a very rigorous definition of what breakthrough results are. We could, if they followed the methodology we gave them, we could promise, and we had data, breakthrough results. But that's not transformation. That's an event. It was enough to get them in the room and introduce them to transformation, as long as we gave them access to what we promised, which was breakthrough results. And those were small groups. There was never anybody, nobody ever got damaged. In fact, what they got, some of them left their job. That was the worst you could say about it. Some companies were unhappy that they paid $100,000 all in on the thing and the person quit. But, that happens.
How could you breakthrough results, though? Or how could you even say...
I didn't say we promised breakthrough results. I said we promised just what you said, the tools that allow you to create breakthrough results.
I got it. Okay.
By a very specific definition of breakthrough results, which is you've got a certain curve of predictability, and you're going to produce results outside that curve. And that's not hard to do, by the way, because the curve of predictability is so conservative that if you just use lateral thinking, you can produce breakthrough results.
So here's kind of what I think one of the challenges is that if you've got an industry that's not regulated, so this is not like psychotherapy, it's not like you have to have a particular qualification, and there's relatively low barriers to entry, then if you've got people that have got the option of going the difficult routes and trying to sell a program that adds value but isn't as flashy and that sort of thing, or you've got the opportunity to risk people a bit, to roll the dice with their mental health, but you're going to get these really positive results. And you know that it's very difficult to get sued because it's hard to prove that there is damage. And I'd say that the vast majority of people that are harmed don't have the financial or psychological resources to do anything about it. It's going to attract the wrong sort of people. And when you look at these smaller organizations, and I won't even speak about EST and LifeSpring and these organizations, but the hundreds of copycat organizations that have emerged, it's all these people that want to have power, that have found this quick way of making money and of having a sense of importance, and they don't necessarily know what they're doing at all, and they're willing to risk things. I don't know how that could be managed or regulated. I think it's going to automatically attract the wrong sort of people. And even if there was regulation, I would say that there's also massive scope for corruption amongst regulating bodies. And I think that that's a huge issue as well. So my view is that the more people that understand about these organizations and what the warning signs are, the better. So it's up to individuals. So I'm kind of preaching that everyone has to be responsible for themselves, which is ironic, I guess. But that is what I think should be going on. And I think the very fact that we're talking about large group awareness training and we're not talking about a particular organization is a really important step, because that allows people to kind of link these things together. I mean, on my website at the moment, there's a guy that got hold of me from Taiwan. His video on basically LifeSpring-based organizations has been viewed 5.5 million times in 5 weeks. So everyone in Taiwan seems to now know what these things are. They understand what the risks are, and there's a common language that's being used, and I think that is incredibly helpful.
Yeah, you and I are very much on the same page, John. I agree with everything you said, except I laughed a little when you talked about psychotherapy being regulated.
Well, yeah. Yeah, I don't even want to get into the Health Professionals Council of South Africa, but in theory, yes, yeah.
Well, and you just described, for example, I won't name the organization, but there is an organization that came directly out of was then Werner Erhard and Associates. that certifies coaches. That organization was founded by a guy who, when I worked there, was the head of finance. I have no idea what he knew about coaching, but he created that low barrier to entry opportunity to get a certificate that said you're a coach, and people flocked to it, and now it's become people require it. So and the same thing very much. One second, and the same thing very much in the case of Technico or transformational technologies. Warner created an organization where anybody who would pay for a license got a license. And so a lot of people whose only qualification, not all, I'll say that, but a lot of people whose only qualification was they were a landmark seminar leader or they had done the training or, there was no requirement. They just paid for the license, showed up at the conferences where Werner taught them what he wanted to teach them.
And then if you're not using that approach, I'm guessing that you may be excluded from those necessary licenses as well. So
you'd be sued.
So if you're trying to do it in the right way, then you don't have an opportunity.
Yes, exactly right. And in the coaching world, not so much. But those organizations have so now institutionalized their licensing that you at least I when I go to talk to businesses about coaching, they ask me, well, do you have this certification or that? I say, no, I was coaching before those people started licensing people, and I trained a lot of those people. So no, I refuse to get I could get it, but I won't give it that much credibility.
Well, this is where Gene Brown of the Seek Safely organization, which I've partnered very closely with, we did a talk recently developed a talk, now available for anybody else who wants to do it out there listening. We'd love to come and do this talk everywhere where people are interested. But we were talking about this whole area, and we had our own triangle at the end. And at the top of the triangle, and our triangle was about what do we see as some of the solutions towards the unethical and harmful behaviors? How can we protect ourselves? At the very top, the small part of the triangle was laws. We do need better laws and regulations for sure. But that's really for what happens when something goes really wrong, and it has a certain amount of effect in how people organize themselves. But mostly the laws are there for when the worst happens. And then kind of moving down the triangle, the middle of the triangle, which is still smaller than the bottom, but bigger than the top, we had practitioners. But practitioners need to educate themselves. We need to stop being afraid of these kinds of conversations, the kind of conversations the three of us are having here right now today. Stop being afraid of them. They're not dangerous, other than you might find out that you have been doing something that was unethical or potentially dangerous and you didn't realize it. So that's a really good situation because you want to know before you realize it. So practitioners really educating themselves have the belief, I don't know whether it's true or not, it's kind of my hypothesis, John, is that if we create the safe and ethical practice of personal development as a marketplace advantage, but it's got to come with some real meat behind it. You have to do a training. There has to be an accountability structure, all of which I'm, gathering.
What's the bottom? What's the bottom?
I'm getting there. So but my point is, because a lot of practitioners, here's my thing with practitioners, they go, but I would never do anything harmful. I'm like, well, how the hell do you know? How do you know? You're not trauma informed. Instead of looking at what an LGAT is, you go, I'm not an LGAT. How can you say that if you don't know what it is? How can you, like that? So I've got a lot there for practitioners. And then the bottom of the triangle is the consumer. The consumer has the most power, and they don't realize it. In part, their power works only if they're united, not if they're divided. And if the consumer starts asking tougher questions, which the age of the internet has made that somewhat possible, although very confusing, and we've got to have that middle section. You have to have a place that people can go and say, okay, it's not about is this person certified or not. It's what are the teachers that this person follows? What work have they done? Are they really trauma informed? Are they really engaged with what it means to be a safe and ethical practitioner or business? And how do we measure that? And we're so at the beginning. We have so much work to do to put
I have a suggestion. I think your top of the triangle law is unfeasible. The lawmakers won't touch this stuff. If you look at medicine, lawmakers say you have to be licensed, and they leave it to the licensing. I would put at the top licensing, ethical codes, and certification. And then,
but didn't we just talk about how certification can be so? What about I mean, I can get
it can be, but it doesn't have to be. Medical certification is a highly rigorous process. Right. Now, granted, some people squeak past, but relatively few. If somebody's board certified in neurosurgery, you can pretty well count on that they know what they're doing.
I would put that in the middle section, that the practitioners need to be accountable for that.
And so you have to give them something to be accountable for.
Right.
Okay. So give them the ethics code, give them the standards of certification, give them, the standards of ethical practice,
et cetera. Well, so I'm sort of curious because
somebody got it.
Well,
your group is as good as any, as far as I'm concerned.
International Coaching Federation created them amongst themselves.
Right, but they don't apply to anybody else. Here's the thing. There are people, for example, Thomas Hubel, Otto Scharmer, people like this that are experts in trauma-informed coaching. I'm doing a course with someone, Jen Cohn, who's an expert in trauma-informed coaching. You bring people like that in. They think like you. They are interested in working with people in a way that, A, doesn't exacerbate the trauma and has the possibility of healing. There are people that can do that.
Great. I look forward to the introduction. So but that's my point is but these are the conversations we've got to engage in. And we're still mostly, I think we're on the fringe, the three of us, unfortunately, still growing.
Welcome to my life.
Well, by meaning that we're really after this, we're interested in this, and we're talking about the dangers. Mostly people are still at they're still watching the cult porn and thinking it doesn't
being outraged.
Me.
People are very good at being outraged and not doing anything about it.
Yeah, well, and that's my big thing too, is the whole, not just the outrage, but it doesn't apply to me. And we're seeing all over the world, that's just not true. There's no human being alive, no level of education. In fact, if you think that what we're talking about in terms of the harms does not apply to you, you are the most susceptible. Hands down. So, and if you're a practitioner that thinks I would never harm anybody, you're also high on the list of people who will inadvertently do harm, because you're not educating yourself in the ways that would ensure you don't do harm. For the most part, that's a generalization. I'm sure there's people that are to an extent, but it's still the smaller segment. I meet them every day. People call me and oh, I'm a safe and ethical practitioner. I'm like, okay, what's your grounds for saying that? And they'll say, and it's almost always some version of, I have good heart.
Well, I mean, that's a start, I think.
It's a good place to start. That's right.
Good intentions is definitely a good start. And I certainly don't think that that's the case with every organization that I've interacted with. It's good intentions. I think sometimes it's kind of indifference and money's driving it. And that's really as far as it goes. So it's certainly a useful place to begin. I wanted to, before we end, I don't know how close we are to end, but I have got that study. I thought I could quickly show it. You can cut it out if necessary. I don't know if I'm sharing properly here.
I don't know. I haven't done
that.
Down
next to leave is a button called share.
I think, and you should be able to hit presentation.
Let me know if you can see it.
There, yes.
I can't. Where are you seeing it, Ed?
On my screen.
Oh, there. Okay, just took a minute.
It is a small world, no kidding.
So you can see that it's 1989. You can see in terms of the abstract, it says the short-term outcome analyses revealed that only perceived control was affected by forum participation and no long-term treatment effects were observed. A little bit lower down, you can see over here, it says the authors would like to thank Werner Eyals and Associates who permitted the researchers to access the forum subject population, et cetera, et cetera. So,
yeah, but look at the next sentence. John, look at the next sentence after that.
What does it say there? It was conducted under a formal agreement between Werner Eyals and Associates and the researchers dated May 6, 1985, guaranteeing the researchers complete independence in every phase of the the project.
No, they never obviously publicized it, but it looks to me, and knowing Jack, I don't know the other people, I suspect that that's the truth, that they had full independence.
I mean, I very much doubt that if they were influenced, it would have come up with such unflattering results. So it does seem like it was done independently.
The level of control that people like me experienced, starting in the 90s and through the 2000s, and certainly in my time working with Werner, which was from 2010 or so to 2019 directly, there was a lot more control. And my suspicion is because of studies like that, because things have gone wrong. There's another really fantastic paper, and I'll link these in the show notes, called Est in Prisons. And it's I don't know if you've read that one, John. It's really interesting because it's written, by the guy who was sort of a stand, it would be our internal language, for this offer that Werner and the trainers had made to go and do the S training at the time in prisons with prisoners. And there's been various projects with that throughout time. But this paper is really interesting because even in the course
who wrote that
paper, you can see the controls. I don't remember. I have to pull it up.
I'd like to. I haven't seen that in many, many years. I'd like to see that again. If you could send it to me.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
I remember when it was done.
50 pages into the 100-page thing. I have to read this stuff in spits and starts because to regulate my own nervous system.
Well, Synanon set the tone where they went into prisons and they ran the game. In fact, a guy named Marty Groder, who's passed on now, who was one of my associates in transactional analysis back in the day. And they were going into, Marion, which is the toughest of the tough federal prisons, and running Synanon games. And that became then, if you really want to prove you're good, you got to go into prison. So S did it, Lifespring did it, Mankind Project still does it, not officially, but Mankind Project people still do it.
I need to look into Mankind Project. I don't know that much about it.
They're in South Africa, John.
Oh, really?
Great people too, fabulous people. Yeah, you should definitely look it up and let me know if you want. I'll introduce you to the South African people. I chaired the project in the USA, so I'm connected. I'm not active now, but
I found the prison paper. So research on Earhart seminar training in correctional institutions. Ray E. Hosford, Hosford, University of California, Santa Barbara. C. Scott Moss, Federal Correction Institutions. Lompoc, Helen Cavort, CAVIOR, Federal Prison Service Regional Office, Burlingame, and Burton Karish, Federal Correction Institution.
And you notice there's only one person on that of those authors who's not in the federal correctional system.
Yeah, and as you go into it, I'll find a way to link it.
Send it to me. Send it
on the show notes or whatnot. But it's very fascinating because it kind of shows a lot. First, the altruistic desire, like we're going to give trainers, but then suddenly there is no money and they have to pay for it. And so it gets
there was
scary.
One motivation behind the prison trainings that I know of. Prove you can work with people that are as tough and resistant as you're ever going to find. It wasn't altruistic. It wasn't financial. It was like, be able to make the statement, if you can work there, you can work with them, you can work with anybody.
Wow. Well, gentlemen, we're nearing an hour and a half, so it's probably I want to give just a last minute opportunity. I'm sure the three of us will meet again, but if there's any questions that you have for each other or for the floor, is there anything that we didn't discuss that you had hoped to look at or say? Or
not right now. I think it's been very useful for me. So it's been great meeting you properly, Ed. And thanks for organizing.
And you, John. And if I've been getting to Botswana about once a year for the last few years. So if I make it again, which is a real possibility, I'll make time for us to get together.
Let me know, yeah.
I will do.
Great.
Well, I really appreciate your time and the work of both of you. I've learned so much from both of you in different ways, both in this conversation, but in the work that you've done ahead. And I just really appreciate folks that are willing to get on the court and look at okay, I've seen thousands of people go through these trainings, and I've sat there in those rooms while people declare, miracles for themselves in their lives. And in my heart of hearts, I want to believe in that. And I want to believe that that really makes that kind of difference in people's lives. And I also want to be clear-eyed and open-minded, because that momentary shift in perception does not become a long-term
Right.
result without some serious engagement.
Yeah.
And I think we've got too much selling of hocus pocus going on in too many fields, whether it's politics, medicine, or mental health.
In every one of those cases, what makes a difference in people's lives is people's engagement, commitment, and practice.
And critical
and
thinking.
particularly practice in community. And that's what I mean by engagement, critical thinking.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So please, folks, do not be afraid to ask questions. Do not be afraid to question your own reality and beliefs. It's safe on the other side. I promise. I can tell you from my journey, it's not always easy. Not always easy. It's been a rough year as I've had to confront all the kinds of damage that was done in an organization that I love so much. So thank you, gentlemen. And I look forward to more conversations soon.